Okay, Ira, should we start? It's okay.
Yeah, we can begin.
Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, and I'm speaking to you from Oxford, England. And I'm pleased to bring another ISGAP seminar to everybody here who's tuning in. Today we have a very important webinar. We have Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, and they're going to be speaking. The title of their lecture is The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path for Peace, or to peace rather. And this discussion is based on their new book. It was just published and released. It's published by Macmillan, and you can get it online today. If you search for the book, you can get it online. And my colleague Ira Guberman will try to email you the link to the book while we're having the seminar, and we'll send it out as an announcement also with ISGAP. It's an important book. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Adi and to Einat. Adi Schwartz is an Israeli researcher and author. His work focuses on the Arab-Israeli conflict and Israeli history and current affairs. Adi is also a fellow at the Center for International Communications at Bar-Ilan University, where he's focusing his research on the Palestinian refugee problem and the history of Jewish people from Arab countries. Adi is also a former staff writer and a senior editor for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and he's published articles in the Israeli press as well as in the Wall Street Journal, the Forward, the Tablet, and the Jewish Chronicle. And he's also a graduate of the ISGAP Oxford Summer Institute, and we met a few years ago there. So it's a pleasure to have Adi with us. It's also an honor to have Einat Wilf. Einat is a leading intellectual and commentator on matters of foreign policy, economics, and education, and as well as Israel and the Jewish people. She's considered one of Israel's most articulate representatives on the international stage in terms of diplomacy, and she's written widely on in international papers and publications on issues of Israeli and Middle Eastern affairs. She's a former member of the Israeli Knesset, or parliament. She served from 2010 to 2013 on behalf of the Labour Party and independent parties. And according to media reports, she was considered one of the leading candidates for Israel's ambassador at the United Nations. She has a PhD in political science from Cambridge University, and she was born in Israel and raised in Israel, and she served as an intelligence officer in the IDF. So it's really a pleasure to have both of you with us, and especially as you're launching your important book, which I urge people to read. And Adi gave me an advanced copy, which I'm grateful, and I looked through it, so I read through it. So thank you, Adi. So we're going to start first with Adi, and then Einat will follow. And I'm asking each of you to please speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to everybody for questions. And for those of you listening, if you text me a question in the chat area of the Zoom, I'll make sure to try and bring as many questions to Adi and to Einat after they finish speaking. So Adi, please, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Charles, and good evening. And first of all, thanks for having us and giving us this opportunity. The starting point for our book is a question that I think many people ask themselves, but we were asking ourselves, why is there no peace in the Middle East? Why is there no peace between Palestinians and Israelis? And for years, it seemed that we had the formula. It was quite clear, at least we thought so, how peace should be achieved. We thought that Israel is supposed to cede territories that it captured in the 1967 war, and the Palestinians are supposed to build their own independent states on those territories. And that was the goal, or so it seemed, of Oslo, and later on of Ehud Barak's plan and meeting and summit in Camp David, and later on Ehud Olmert's suggestion. And I supported all those initiatives. And the hope was indeed that an independent state in the territories would put an end to the conflict. It seemed that we can have a happy ending, an end of conflict, end of story, everybody's happy. But soon enough, it became understood that this is not how the Palestinians view it. Because in 2000, they were offered supposedly exactly what they wanted. Supposedly, they wanted an independent Palestinian state, but they didn't say yes. Instead, they opened the second intifada. And that happened again in 2008, when Prime Minister Ehud Olmert suggested even a better deal. And again, there was no yes. So I think that at that point, I can speak of myself, I thought that I have to go back to the drawing table and ask myself, what did I miss here? What went wrong? I mean, the Palestinians were supposed to say yes, clear and simple, and that didn't happen. And simultaneously, another process happened, and I think both me and Einat, through speaking and meetings, we discovered that the refugee issue is much bigger than I think we both, or everybody, understood before. Because usually when you listen to policymakers, politicians, scholars even, they tend to speak a lot about the territories, about settlements, about where the border should be, security issues, even Jerusalem from time to time. But the issue of the refugees seems like something that you don't have to talk about too much. It is obvious that the Palestinians know that they're not going back. Or people say that this is a bargaining chip, that the Palestinians will somehow just give up at the last moment. But when you listen to the Palestinians themselves, and I had the chance, meetings and listening to them, to know and to realize that in fact the Palestinians see the refugee issue as much more central in their narrative, in their ethos, and in their actual demands. For them, it is not a bargaining chip. For them, it is not just something abstract or open to negotiation. And that was the moment when I decided, and we joined forces together with Einat, to see what it means. How did it happen? And ask ourselves the question, how is it that after 72 years, after Israel's independence and after the war ended, how is it that we still have more than 5 million refugees? This is an unprecedented and unparalleled situation. There were many wars in the 40s and afterwards in Africa, in Yugoslavia, in Asia, and unfortunately, refugees are a side effect of war. It happens. But only in our case, only in the Israeli-Palestinian case, we still have more than 5 million people who consider themselves to be refugees, even though if you look at the international standards, you will see that most of them are actually not refugees. Many of them speak of a right of return as if they possess such a legal sanctioned international right, which is not the case. And this is actually the book. This is what the book deals with, how this problem developed, what kind of role did UNRWA play in it, and UNRWA played in it a very negative role. And we try to explain that this problem is still with us today, and it is central in the peace negotiations and the central demand of the Palestinians that remains to this day.
Okay.
So,
Adi, thank you very much. Einat, thank you, Adi.
So indeed, Adi and I went through a similar process of thinking that there was a clear path to peace, and then finding that when Israel did offer land for peace, unlike in the case of Egypt or even Jordan, with the Palestinians, it did not lead to peace. And for me, in meeting some of the Palestinians during this period, what struck me is that their understanding of the conflict had nothing to do with the questions we discuss in the media typically, like borders and statehood and settlements and occupation. They said things like, the Jewish people are not a people. You're only followers of a faith. It's only about a religious identity and religious practice, which you can do as a minority in any other country. You're not a people, you're not a nation, and therefore you're not deserving of what nations and peoples deserve, which is the right to self-determination, the right to a state where nations and peoples govern themselves. They denied any connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, calling it a made-up history. And I realized that we're actually talking about very different conflicts. I grew up thinking that the conflict is about how we divide the land between the two peoples who have a legitimate claim to it. And I realized that from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, one side, the Jewish people, are not a legitimate claimant at all. And therefore, any solution to the conflict has to be one in which this claim is nullified. Today, we mark Israel's Day of Independence, 72 years of independence. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, what I realized is that this independence is provisional. It's still temporary. It's an aberration in the Arab and Islamic history of the region since the 7th century, an aberration that will be corrected sooner or later. It wasn't corrected by military means initially, but it could still be corrected by this idea of return, the idea of millions of Palestinians settling within Israel, making it into an Arab state with a Jewish minority, which is the proper status of Jews in the Arab world, and then the conflict is over. So I realized that when Palestinians speak of justice and rights, and this is the language they especially use in the West, they do not mean it in general terms, which Westerners typically think. For them, justice is very clear. Justice means correcting the injustice, which is the very existence of the state of Israel. It's an annihilationist form of justice. When they speak of rights, which sounds very kind of acceptable, who can be against rights, they have only one right in mind, which is the right of return, which again is neither a right nor a return. The millions of Palestinians who demand it have never been in Israel, did not grow up there. So that's the right that they demand, that's the justice they demand. And when we began at DNI to ask the question of how is it that we still have millions of people who claim to be refugees from a war in which almost all of them never participated, they were born after the war, is to go to the bottom line. What we realized, and it's a bit depressing, is that from their perspective, the war is not over. We mark 72 years of Israeli independence today, but from the Palestinian perspective, the war is not over. They might have lost several battles. Most prominently, they lost the Battle of 1948, but it's merely a battle in a long war, which they still expect to ultimately win. Whether it takes 1 generation or 10 generations, they expect to ultimately win that war and therefore see no reason to compromise in the interim. Now, the book focuses, especially the English version of the book, it came out in Hebrew 2 years ago, focuses on the Western indulgence of this Palestinian idea of from the river to the sea, that Israel is provisional and that its independence could be basically one day undone. And what we're arguing is that one of the main causes that fuels this conflict, that makes this conflict so long and so difficult to resolve, is the Western indulgence of this Palestinian vision. It's one thing for the Palestinians to have a vision that says, we don't want Israel from the river to the sea. That's fine. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of Israeli Jews who would have that vision. The question is whether this vision is being indulged, fueled, and supported by the West. And the problem is that it is. When Jews in Israel have a vision of from the river to the sea, it's not supported or indulged, at most in the margins, certainly not in the West. When Palestinians say from the river to the sea, it's not only indulged, it's actually financially supported. An entire organization, UNRWA, infrastructure, is created to sustain the Palestinians in this notion that they are still refugees from a war that happened over 7 decades ago. They receive regular funding. They're supported in the notion that they are still refugees. And our argument in that sense, Adi and I are still very much of the Israeli peace camp. Our argument is that to get to peace, if we want to end the conflict, we need to take away the fuel that extends the conflict. And one major source of fuel is Western indulgence of the Palestinian idea that Israeli independence is temporary, provisional, and an aberration that will one day be corrected in the Arab and Islamic history of the region since the 7th century.
Okay, thank you very much, Einat. So I'll start with you. I want to start the questions. We're already having a few people are sending in their questions. And for those of you who are listening, please feel free to send more questions. I'll try to work as many in to the conversation. But I'll start off with the question to you, Einat. So I find it interesting in that you come from, I'd say, progressive background, so does Adi, so do I, kind of a progressive human rights background, liberal background, social democracy, human rights, and that sort of thing. So my question is, when we speak in the West, many liberals find it difficult to hear kind of the Israeli or Jewish narrative when it comes to confronting this issue, which you and Adi do. So my question is, what is the ideology that's sort of driving not only the Palestinian or the Islamic response to Zionism and the establishment of the Jewish state, but also what's driving kind of our ideology? Because to think of borders and boundaries, it's sort of a modern nation state mentality. It's a modern mentality. Whereas I think the Palestinians are coming from a different ideological perspective. So what do you think the roots are of this perspective, and how is it different maybe than a Western liberal worldview?
The roots are very deep, and Adi will also speak to it, to the Jews, especially in the Arab world. I do a lot of writing on Zionism and feminism and showing how you spoke about modern ideologies, how they emerge from the same root, from the Enlightenment idea, from the idea of human rights, from the idea of self-determination, that people are agents of history. But from the Arab and Islamic perspective, they have for 1,000 years known only a very particular kind of Jew. Again, and that's a bit like the comparison I do to feminism, that for thousands of years, men have known only particular kind of women. The Jew that bows their head, that is basically of a lower status in their society, and that is generally headed to the dustbin of history, because ultimately the proper person will acknowledge that Islam is the answer and move to the future. Being Jewish is viewed as something of the past, as being stuck in the past. I sometimes joke that the Jews in Islam are the people who got the first book right, but not the sequels. So why are they not moving with the times? The Zionism, in that sense, is a break in the Arab and Islamic view of history, and in many ways, in some parts of the West. The notion that the Jews are headed to the dustbin of history, Zionism brings back the Jews into history as agents of history, as agents of change, and ultimately as a self-determining people who are masters of their fate. And that is something that a civilization does not immediately adjust to. It will, I think it can happen. I do not belong to the camp that says, okay, Islam will never accept it, the West will never accept it. I think it can change, but only slowly and only under duress. Now, in terms of the West, I think especially with the Palestinians, there's a bit of what I've come to see as a neo-colonial attitude. They refuse to see the Palestinians and the Arabs as agents of history, as people who know what they're thinking. Even the thinking that of Arab imperialism, of Arab colonialism, of the fact that the region is Arab and Islamic because of 7th century conquests, is something that the West somehow rejects. And this neo-colonial attitude somehow refuses to listen to the Palestinians. I've invented a word for it called West-plaining. We all know what mansplaining is, and West-plaining, like mansplaining, deprives the other side of agency. Mansplaining is about women not knowing what they think. West-plaining is about somehow Palestinians not knowing what they think. Palestinians tell the West, return is a holy right. We demand it. We demand acknowledgement of this right. And what do you hear from the West? They don't mean it. They know it's not going to happen. The Palestinians don't know that it's not going to happen. In many ways, they're entirely rational in having a long view of history that says in an Arab and Islamic region with dominance, 500 million Arabs, 1.5 billion Muslims nearly, 7 million Jews are not going to survive for the long term as sovereign and independent. And this long-term view of history is what drives them. They're not people who do not know what they're fighting for.
Adi, do you want to address the issue, or?
Yes, I can. I just want to add an illustration, perhaps. That's the story of Bernadotte. He was the first mediator, actually, that was appointed by the United Nations to try to find a solution back in 1948. And what Einat just said was exactly illustrated in his mission, because he wrote in his diary, he wrote a diary that when he meets in Cairo and Damascus, he meets all the, the prime ministers and the heads of the Arab League, etc. And they tell him again and again that they will never recognize a Jewish state and there's nothing to talk about, etc., etc. And then he goes out and he writes something in his diary that he's very pleased to see that the Arabs still consider him to be a decent person or a decent mediator in a very, such a tone. And then he goes to Tel Aviv and he meets Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharet and actually yelling at them that they should do more. So when Moshe Sharet and Ben Gurion say something like that they need borders that they can defend, and there's no way talking about bringing back refugees in the middle of the war, something that was never suggested or, to any other country, then he starts yelling at him. And there's even one more anecdote that he's very pleased to meet a delegation of old rabbis. And he writes in his diary that at last he met some decent rabbis and not like the Zionist fanatics. So what's interesting here is the triangle between the Zionist entity, the Arab states, and the Western mediator. First of all, he was very accustomed to those old image of the Jews who are obedient with their big beards, white beards, and they are the defenseless, weak Jews who are nicer because they can't do harm, they can't do anything. And whenever he meets a Zionist leader like Ben Gurion and Sharet, he becomes very upset and he's yelling at them. So I think this is a very illustrative, anecdote to see. And unfortunately, it did not end with Bernadotte. So if you look to all those mediators who came after him, you see some kind of a pattern. Israel is easier to press. Israel is easier to, to talk to. And therefore, you press it more. I want to add one more thing, and that is that we have to take another consideration of realpolitik. If you look at 1948, these days, the landscape changed because the Arab world has become much weaker. The oil is much less important, and the Arab world is you can't talk about one bloc. There is no more Arab world, whereas in the 50s there was. And, honestly, when you look at the quotes of the heads of the Pentagon, of the State Department in the 40s and the 50s, they say very frankly, with all due respect, there are 600,000 Jews and 60 million Arabs. Why should we support the Jews? So we have to remember all the time that this is a very unbalanced political landscape, whereas Jews had always need to play with their weaker cards. So that's also another aspect of the Western attitude.
Interesting. So you're both touching on very important, fundamental questions. So there's a question which addresses some of the issues already raised by Michael Goldstein. And he's speaking about liberal Jews in the United States. So of course I think there's a rift. I think the American society is divided. I think the American Jewish community has divisions within it, and the community has some tension, maybe for the first time in a significant way, with Israel and Israeli society. So Michael Goldstein's asking that liberal Jews in the United States are among the most indulgent regarding the Arab insistence of the right of return, not understanding the reality that that if this were to be accomplished, it would mean the ultimate dismantling or maybe weakening of Israel as a Jewish state. Most are not aware of the equivalent numbers of Jews who were ejected from their homes of Arab countries in the Middle East, the Mizrahi Jews, and their families who lived in countries and came to Israel as refugees. You are described in the promo for this event, okay, you're described in the promo for this event as, quote, liberal Israelis who support two-state solution for Israel and for Palestinians. Today, are you bringing a message to the American Jewish community who understand the right of return issue? How have you been speaking to American liberal Jewish community leaders and audiences and European Jews who need to develop a more nuanced understanding of for their demands to be implemented in terms of the right of return? Is the right of return a non-starter? So how basically what Michael Goldstein is asking is, how do you explain to, I guess, liberal, well-meaning Jewish members of the Jewish community who are supportive of Israel to some extent, who are making demands that are difficult, if not impossible, to implement? Do they need to not only read your book, but they need to have a deeper understanding of the Palestinian and the Islamic worldview? How would you address this? How would you address the liberal American Jew who wants two-state solution and peace?
So I'll start. First of all, yeah, they do need to read our book, and our book will supply the history. I mean, this is very much the intention of what we're doing. And you're right that liberal American Jews are one of the main groups that we're hoping to reach with this book. Another would be policymakers in the West, because often a D&I would come out of meeting, whether with Western diplomats or others, and we would feel that we're in the process of dismantling a mountain of lies that has been built at least over 7 decades about what this conflict is about. And this is also why the book, certainly thanks to Adi, is very meticulous in its research and really showing the scope of history. Because especially young people on campuses, they're seeing certain snippets, certain images. As we mentioned, the Palestinians speak of rights and justice. Notice that the groups on campus are not called Students for an Independent Palestinian State or Students for Palestinian Independence. It's called Students for Justice in Palestine. And normally people think justice, great, justice for the downtrodden. Who doesn't want that? Not understanding what the conception of justice means to the Palestinian, the annihilationist conception of justice, which means no sovereign Jewish state. And these are some of the things that we're bringing to the fore. One of the ways that I speak about it, certainly still very much a liberal and a progressive, is from 2 directions. The first is I say, look, let's think of a new definition of being a progressive. That has to do with the West-plaining, the neo-colonial attitude. How about we define being a progressive as giving people the respect of taking them at their word, rather than this neo-colonial West-plaining attitude? If the Arab Palestinians say that they want the right of return, that they demand Palestine from the river to the sea, how about we take them at their word? And the other aspect is really what happens when you take them at their word. And here, one of the reviews of the book started by saying that if you read the book, it's a little depressing because That's the reason that so many people want to be blind to the idea that Arabs and Palestinians demand truly from the river to the sea. Because what are you going to do if they're serious about it? If they're serious about it, then that means that we don't have an easy path to peace. There's no simple solution. There's no easy formula of just land for peace, get rid of the settlements, give over the land and we'll have peace. It means that this is much more difficult, more fundamental. And generally people don't want to deal with that. So what I present is a kind of long-term optimist vision that says, yes, peace is possible, but we're not going to get any closer to this if you continue to indulge this idea. And for me, the tragedy of what's happening in the West now, certainly among some liberal Jews, is that at the very moment, as Adi said, that the Arab world, for its own historical development, is beginning to move away from the idea that Israel is the root of all evil in the region, and even beginning to develop a positive attitude towards it. You're seeing it in some Gulf states and Saudi. At the moment that the Arab world is beginning to move away from that, you're seeing the West rushing in to fill the void and to say, no, keep fighting, keep fighting for your rights, for justice, we're behind you. And in doing so, they're merely extending the conflict.
Yeah, and it's also, just to add a brief comment, those of us who are studying the Middle East and Islamic ideology and political Islam, when we bring to the attention of Western liberals, of Jewish liberals, the reactionary ideology, its sexism, its homophobia, and its genocidal anti-Semitism, we're portrayed as right-wing Trump supporters and advocates of Zionism. We're not scholars. So there is a willful blindness, I would say, that runs deep in the West that we're up against. We have a question from Robert Meth. First of all, he says Hag Sameach, so Hag Sameach to everybody. So he says that Taba proved that even if the conflict is about land, it took to ceding every grain of sand to have peace, even with Egypt. So how could there be peace with the Palestinians without ceding the entire state of Israel? So is there space in the Palestinian ideology or in Islamic law that would allow the self-determination of the Jewish people to exist in some form? Is true peace, real peace, possible? How do you want to?
So I'll take this one, and the short answer is no, unfortunately. And it has a few levels. First of all, I'm not aware of any speaker, public figure, or prominent Palestinian who said that a solution of a two-state means that there will be no return of refugees. And there are many instances for that. For example, the Palestinians don't use the term two states for two peoples. They use always, Saib Arakat, and this is important, they always use two states living side by side peacefully. Now, that might sound like something, not so important, but that is crucial, because in their mind, if you will agree to their right of return, it means that you will have one state which is Arab, let's say in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then you will have another state in which the Palestinians will have a right to return to, and as the number of refugees right now is 5.5 million, you understand that it will not be a Jewish state, but another Arab state. So that is the vision. Even if it happens in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, that is the vision. Now, if you go deeper a little bit into the Islamic thought and to the notions of how the relationship between Jews and Muslims should be like, then the entire land which is controlled by Muslims belongs to Muslims. There is no notion of someone else, Christian, Druze, Jewish, to control the land. If in terms of scholarship, you can call it the body politic belongs to Muslims. So Jews are tolerated. That's the official term. But what does it mean to tolerate? It means that you can live, You can practice your religious, rituals such as kashrut and etc., etc., but you cannot participate in the political decision making. Now, I'll give you just one example. Iraq in the 20s was supposedly the most liberal, most advanced country towards the Jews. They had a constitution. The king was the King Faisal, which a few years earlier was signed an agreement with Weizmann. So this is really the best the Jews could have. And the constitution supposedly granted equal rights to the Jews. This seems like Western Europe. That's very nice, but in fact, the Jews only had one senator in the parliament, and he was never supposed to talk about serious issues. So he was something like the member of parliament that you have today in Iran. He was sitting there, and he was, an elderly and prominent person, but he had nothing to say about decision making. So this is the vision of the Jews. They can be tolerated, maybe even respected if they know their place as a minority, but certainly they cannot lead armies. They cannot be foreign ministers. By the way, if you look at the Arab countries, you will see many finance ministers. You will see many Jews who work as accountants and bankers, etc., but you will not find defense ministers or foreign ministers. Again, the same vision. Jews are not supposed to, affairs of the state. They're not supposed to do that. And if you take that to present day Israel, then of course the notion that Jews, you have a prime minister, you have an army, you have airplanes, etc., etc., this is anathema to the classic Muslim vision of how policy should be handled.
Okay, thanks. So there's a question from Greg Mashberg, who's affiliated with ISGAP. He's from New York, and he's asking a similar question. So there's a concept, as you were saying, Adi, in Islam, of the inalienability of Islamic lands, meaning that Islamic lands conquered at the time of the Prophet belonged to Islam and Muslims. This doctrine is expressed explicitly in the Hamas Charter. My question is whether we should recognize the right of return as a species of this concept of inalienability, reflecting the essential religious nature of the conflict, and thus actually is much worse than is this much worse than conventional wisdom? So if this is a religious conflict, is this much more severe than two nations fighting over boundaries and land? So Einat, do you want to?
Yeah. Hi, Greg. So certainly what we've discovered is the very deep roots of the conflict that go to the Arab and Islamic understanding of the proper place of the Jews. And that's certainly not as equals, as sovereign, as Adi said, as people who are masters of their fate and basically do not need to ask any greater power for whether they live or die. Now, this is where Adi and I have different or interesting discussions and sometimes different views, which we typically reconcile by the kind of the question of time, because I don't accept the idea of never in human affairs. The fact that ultimately all religions are made by people. Theologians know that better than everyone. Islam, like Judaism, is a religion of interpretation, and texts can be interpreted in a variety of ways. So the fact that the language that has been used in the conflict for the last century or so is the language of history, of religion, does not mean to me that it is therefore etched in stone and can be unchanged. And the reason that I am more optimistic on the possibility of change is that Islam and the Arab world can change its story. We see it now in the Gulf and Arab states. Again, it's not the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative remains of the Jews as foreign interlopers in a land to which they have no connection. But you're seeing more people who go on TV in Gulf countries, who write op-eds. And if you write an op-ed from a Saudi paper, you're clearly doing it with some sanction, some leeway, that are saying things like, Why does Islam have a problem with the Jews in the land? Islam accepts all three scriptures. Sometimes they speak in even harsher terms about the Palestinians, about the refugee issue, acknowledging that it's been a racket and a scam that has been going on for several decades, and saying that it's time to end it. So I do think that in the future, we can see an Arab identity. And the Arab identity has enough of a history that it doesn't have to be only about being anti-Zionist. So I can see an Arab identity and even an Islamic identity that does accept Israel as a legitimate and indigenous presence in the region and incorporates it into Islamic and Arab thought. But this doesn't happen quickly or easily or without duress and outside pressure. But as the Arab world finds itself under many pressures, I do think we can see the change in that story. And then, so I will modify, at least in my view, I would not go with a strict no. I would say over time, I do think change and true peace are possible.
So thank you. So thank you, Einat. So Adi, following up on that, with this rapprochement that's happening in the Middle East with Saudi and the Gulf states, it's largely, I think, for geostrategic reasons, the threat of Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, now the oil crisis. Do you think that this could be more than a temporary short-term reality? Can there be depth to this rapprochement? And how can we, if it's possible, how can we help facilitate it? What could be done?
Well, first of all, I think that it is crucial to understand that the conflict is indeed not between Israel and the Palestinians alone, but between Israel and the surrounding area, perhaps 300 million Arabs and much more Muslims. If the conflict would be only between Israel and the Palestinians, then it would have ended in 1 month in 1948, in April 1948. In 4 weeks, the Arab Palestinians lost the battles. They lost the main cities of Haifa and Jerusalem and Jaffa. They started fleeing, etc. And only because the Arab states invaded Israel and fought the war, we still have this war. So Israel could have won the war against the Palestinians themselves very quickly. Now, I think that a crucial moment indeed is happening now. And again, I think that the main question is how will the West actually act? Because if Europe, the United States is a little bit different now, but if Europe continues to fuel this fantasy and this very radical vision that Israel can be destroyed, then we might miss this moment. Because indeed, this is a very important moment. There's a realignment of the forces. And you know what? It doesn't really matter if it is for geostrategic matters. That's fine with me. But the question is, will it be helped by the West? Will the West help this phenomena? And for example, I would support very much opening grassroots organizations in the Palestinian society. Why not start discussing the question of, listen guys, you're not going to return anywhere. There is no right of return. This is certainly something the European Union, who is funding many organizations in the West Bank, for example, they can do that. But the question is, what will they do? Will they take this chance and help us perhaps move towards better relations and solving this issue? Or will they continue to, give financial aid endlessly? And by now, you even find the European Union to back diplomatically the Palestinian cause. So they see America as pro-Israel, so they have to be pro-Palestinians. So that's become a very strange situation, which I think is very dangerous for the cause.
Well, thank you. So Paul Loeb, following up on this, Paul Loeb asks, he's concerned that if Joe Biden would win the next presidential election, he may not be such a steadfast ally of Israel, and there may be even questions of support and funding that would come into play under a Biden presidency. So it's, again, touching on your themes of your book. I'm also reminded of how Bernie Sanders was working with Linda Sarsour and other people from CARE and kind of with Muslim Brotherhood background. And we have progressive people in Europe, the Corbyn situation where we had progressive people backing the Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian revolutionary regime. So could you speak on if a progressive ticket would become the next, if Biden or somebody else would become the president, how would this play into the politics of the region, and why is there this sort of red-green alliance, which on the surface of it would seem profoundly contradictory? Einat?
So Biden himself, of course, is not anti-Israel, but he's a politician, and politicians respond to incentives and pressures. And there's no doubt that the Democratic Party is going through a process. It's the outcome of the years that we've seen on campuses, the growth of a radical progressivism that, while I might actually agree with them on many of the issues on healthcare, I mean, seriously, a modern country without universal healthcare, and I can agree with them on questions of inequality, but it's somehow become, and we've seen it certainly in the UK with Corbyn, that somehow these issues began to take a second stage to this anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, which very easily became, or perhaps revealed itself as an anti-Semitic view. And I think there's deep concern that this is building in the Democratic Party. In that sense, the Democratic Party in America is benefiting from the Corbyn debacle because they can see the future. And I think that has been a bit of a force for Jews in the Democratic Party and for others in the Democratic Party to push back against some of these positions. But I'm far from sanguine. For example, on the issue of funding UNRWA. President Trump, for example, defunded UNRWA. We explain in the book why it was, even though it was the right decision, it was a missed opportunity in the way that it was conducted and the lack of follow-up and the lack of building alliances. But when we speak to European diplomats, Adi and myself, their view is certainly that this is temporary. There will be a Democratic president and they will bring back the funding. They don't see it as a long-term change in US policy of stopping to indulge this Palestinian vision that there's still refugees and that Israel can be undone. So it is a concern, and I think the only way is to really fight back all the time and not to be sanguine about the fact that these are minority voices, because certainly in the UK, we've seen how quickly minority voices can take over a major established party and come within, I mean, inches, centimeters of being prime minister.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. There's a question from Tel Aviv from Gianluca Pacciani. I hope I pronounced your name right. And she writes, I suppose that I suppose that the two speakers oppose promoting the creation of a Palestinian state, since the Palestinian leadership would never accept it without the right of return, nor would most of the Arab world. Being a supporter of a two-state solution is pretty much the core definition of what a progressive in Israel is today. Both speakers define themselves as progressive. What does it mean to be an Israeli progressive then, if you take away the notion of a two-state solution? As a progressive person, what's left? So, Adi.
Well, first of all, there's one thing, in principle, I think that when two groups of people, in this case, Jews and Palestinians, have legitimate rights and cause in a certain land, then the notion or the idea of splitting that land, partitioning the land to two entities, two political entities, is a good idea. This is what it means for me to be a supporter of the idea of a two-state solution. But on the ground, the fact is that the only progressive side is the Israeli side, because there is no other partner on the Palestinian side. So again, as we explain in the book, there is no way to sign an agreement with the Palestinian without the right of return. That is not to say that I don't recognize that the Palestinians have rights, and I'm not saying that under no circumstances ever will they have the chance. But I'm just saying that as long as they demand the destruction of the state of Israel, it would be only suicidal for me to accept that. So I don't think that progressiveness means suicidal tendencies. It doesn't have to be the same. And I think the reason why there's a double reason why we wrote that book. First of all, to set the record straight. We have to analyze the conflict and understand what's happening. That's something I wanted to say before. For so many years, both Israelis and Westerners were basically discussing with themselves. This is also something having to do with progressiveness. We have to listen to the Palestinians. The Palestinians say that they will never give up this right. So we have to listen to them to understand what it means. We think that this is a conflict between two ethnic groups with rights in the land, but this is not how they see it. They see themselves as India kicking out England, or Algeria kicking out France. There is no way, by the way, just as they say in the campuses, why should we invite Zionists? We shouldn't put the oppressors and the oppressed together, right? It's not that both sides have some kind of a truth. They say that only the indigenous group themselves have the rights, and we Israelis, Jews, have no rights. So I think the question of being a progressive is a little bit marginal in this case. In this case of the two-state solution, we are not there. We need to build that notion that Jews have also rights in order to get to the stage when we can perhaps have that two-state solution.
Thank you. And there's a question from Carol Klingfeld in Connecticut, and she's raising the question of Jordan. And wasn't Jordan really created in the Palestinian Mandate as the homeland for the Palestinian people? And is this ever going to be a real definitive option or solution to the conflict? In that, is that option valid in any way?
So basically, in the wake of World War I, the Ottoman Empire is being divided among its various peoples and according to certain interests. I always like to mention that if the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, and they were a substantial presence across the empire, if the Jews of the Ottoman Empire got their fair share of the land based on their share of population, Israel would be 6 times the size of what it is today. Now, because of Arab demands, because of the Jews at the time not successfully building a substantial presence just yet because of the Arab response and the pressure on the British, yes, the land was divided and handed over mostly to the Arabs. But at the end of the day, and this is also to what Adi just said about being a progressive, we have a certain reality, which is the situation today. Between the river and the sea, there are 2 groups, Jews and Arabs. Whatever one might think of the other, they're not the other. You know, there's always those who say the Palestinians are an invented people, the Jews are an invented people. I would say, look, can we at least agree that both sides violently agree that they're not the other people? So we have 2 distinct groups of people.
17 hours.
What?
Sorry, no, sorry, go ahead.
So there are 2 distinct groups of people, and I do believe that it is best for both to be masters of their own fate. The problem is indeed that at this point, the Arab side, the Arab Palestinian side, refuses to accept any agreement that would legitimize and finalize the Jewish claim to even part of the land. And that has been, to their credit, their consistent position. Now, how ultimately the Arabs of the land will rule themselves, be it in a way that's related to Jordan as an independent state, that for me are the details that can be worked out once it's understood that the Arab world and the Palestinians within them no longer seek Israel's destruction and accept the Jewish claim to the land as sufficiently legitimate that they're not going to wage war against it, not by return and not militarily. So the Arabs of between the river and the sea are there to stay. The Jews are there to stay. I think it's best if they have separate political entities. How exactly it's going to happen, I think, are details. And the book and the work we do is very much intended to try to pressure the world to the point so that finally there will be an acknowledgement that the Jewish people have a legitimate right and that the path to two states, the path to political partition or agreement has to go from the Arab-Palestinian side acknowledging that the Jews are not foreigners, they're not crusaders, they're not Algeria, they're not England, and they're not going anywhere.
Thank you, Einat. Adi, we're running out of time. Do you want to make one more brief comment, or?
No, if you have more questions, then I'll answer the next one.
No, so actually we're going to wrap up now because we stick to the 60-minute time limit. So
Okay.
I would like to thank you both, Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, very much for participating in the webinar. And I really recommend and I urge our listeners to look at the book, purchase the book. Ira, my colleague, I believe sent the URL. You can get it at Macmillan. And the title of the book is The War of Return, and how Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path for peace. So thank you both very much for participating. And I would just like to mention as an announcement to those watching, on Monday, May the 4th at the same time, at 4 p.m. in the UK, 5 p.m. in Israel, 5 p.m. in Europe, 6 p.m. in Israel, and 11 a.m. in New York. We're going to have Dr. Lorenzo Vadino. Lorenzo is going to be speaking on the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, and he's the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. It should be an important lecture. And then we have Vera Zoborov, who's the executive director of the Bratslav Policy Institute. And she's doing a major study with a group of scholars from the European Union looking at anti-Semitism. They developed a questionnaire and they're interviewing people all over the EU on contemporary anti-Semitism. So she'll be speaking on Wednesday. And the following week, we have Uzi Rabi from the Dayan Center and Professor Amy Ellman, who's dealing with anti-Zionism and sexism, feminism. It should be good. And we have many more lectures coming online. So everybody, thank you for joining us. Adi and Einat, thank you very much, and continued success with your important work and your book. And everybody stay well and be healthy. Take care. Thank you.